For 7 years, no woman could stay near the Alpha King without breaking, but one exhausted maid fell asleep on his chest and made the monster of Blackthorn Citadel sleep like a man. Elowen Vale did not mean to enter the West Wing. Every servant in Ravenholt Dominion knew that corridor was forbidden after sunset. The doors were sealed with silver locks, the windows were barred with black iron, and the guards outside never laughed, never leaned, never looked away. It was where King Aldric Wraithborne spent the nights when his alpha aura grew too heavy for the palace to bear. They said noble women had crossed that threshold wearing diamonds and confidence, only to come out shaking, pale, and unable to speak his name without trembling. They said his wolf rejected every Luna candidate the council placed before him. They said no woman could stand within 10 feet of him for more than a few minutes. Elowen had heard every rumor while scrubbing floors. No one thanked her for cleaning. She had no reason to care. She was a debt maid, a little ghost in a gray dress, known only for carrying linens, polishing brass, and disappearing before anyone important noticed she existed. That night, the storm over Blackthorn Citadel turned the whole fortress into a living thing. Rain lashed the windows. Thunder rolled over the towers. The lamps in the servants' corridor flickered until every shadow looked like a reaching hand. Elowen had been awake since before dawn, hauling wet sheets from the laundry, mending torn uniforms, and scrubbing the marble steps of the Moon Hall until her knees ached. When the head housekeeper shoved a basket of warm blankets into her arms and snapped, "West Side storage now," Elowen obeyed because obedience was safer than questions. She counted 3 turns, then 4. Then lost her way when the storm blew open a side door and drowned the hallway in cold wind. By the time she found a chamber with a dying fire and a massive bed carved from dark oak, her thoughts had blurred into one desperate need: rest. The room smelled of cedar smoke, rain, and something wild beneath it, like winter woods under moonlight. Elowen set down the basket, took one step toward the bed, and saw what she thought was a pile of black furs rising and falling with slow warmth. Her body gave up before fear could warn her. She sat on the edge, meaning only to close her eyes for a second. Instead, she slipped sideways, her cheek landing against something firm, warm, and alive. A heartbeat sounded beneath her ear. Slow, powerful, steady. For the first time in years, Elowen did not dream of unpaid debts, cold kitchens, or voices calling her worthless. She slept. At dawn, the chamber doors opened, and 40 royal guards froze in the hallway. Beta Cashin Thorn went white. The royal healer dropped his satchel. There, beneath the black canopy, King Aldric Wraithborne lay asleep with the little maid curled against his chest, one arm locked around her waist like his wolf had chosen her in the dark and dared the world to take her away. No aura crushed the room. No growl shook the stones. The Alpha King, who had not slept peacefully in 7 years, breathed as calmly as a child under moonlight. Then a guard stepped forward and whispered, "Pull her away." The moment his hand reached for Elowen, Aldric's fingers tightened around her, his eyes opened with a flash of silver, and a single word rolled through the chamber like a royal command. "Mean it." The word did not sound like a threat. It sounded like a law the room had forgotten and his wolf had remembered. Every guard stepped back at once, boots scraping over black stone, while Elowen jolted awake against a chest that felt warmer than the dying fire. For one stunned second, she did not understand where she was. Then she saw the silver eyes above her, the dark hair loose against the pillow, the royal scarlet mark at his throat, and the crown resting on the table beside the bed. Her breath vanished. She tried to pull away, but the arm around her waist tightened just enough to stop her. Not painful, not cruel, only certain. "Your Majesty," Beta Cashin said carefully from the doorway, as if one wrong syllable might crack the walls. "Release the girl." King Aldric Wraithborne did not look at him. His gaze stayed on Elowen, sharp and unreadable, yet strangely quiet. She expected rage. She expected punishment. She expected the crushing force everyone whispered about in the laundry rooms. Instead, she felt only his heartbeat under her palm, slow and steady, like a drum calling something inside her to listen. I am sorry, she whispered, her voice rough from sleep. I got lost. I did not know. A few servants had gathered behind the guards, pale with shock and hunger for gossip. Elowen recognized their faces. They knew her as the girl from the Lower East dormitory, the debt maid who wore repaired shoes and kept her eyes down. In Ravenholt Citadel, she was not a person people remembered. She was a pair of hands carrying water, a shadow folding linen, a quiet figure slipping through kitchens before dawn. Her father had owed 3 winters of grain tax to the Dominion, and when the collectors came, Elowen was the only thing her family had left to offer. She had traveled 20 miles in a supply wagon and entered Blackthorn Citadel with 1 small bag, 1 gray dress, and 1 rule carved into her heart: stay useful, stay silent, stay unseen. She had done that for 2 years. The palace dogs stopped barking when she passed. The nervous stable wolves leaned against their doors when she hummed. Sick pups in the nursery slept faster if she folded blankets nearby. No one called it a gift. They called it coincidence or luck or nothing at all, because girls like Elowen were not allowed to be mysterious. They were allowed to be tired. Across the chamber, the royal healer stared at the king as if witnessing an impossible cure. Everyone in Ravenholt knew what had happened to the Luna candidates. They had not been harmed by Aldric, but his alpha aura pressed too deeply against wolves who were not meant for him. Some trembled. Some fainted. Some woke days later, unable to bear the sound of his name. Because of that, Aldric had locked himself away, not from hatred, but from fear of what his own power could do. Now the healer slowly raised a shaking hand toward Elowen and whispered to Cashin. She did not survive his aura. His aura recognized her. By the time the last guard left the chamber, Elowen's hands were trembling so badly she hid them in the folds of her gray skirt. The door closed with a deep iron sound, leaving only 3 people beneath the black canopy and the dying fire: King Aldric Wraithborne, Beta Cashin Thorn, and the maid who had accidentally done what 12 noble Luna candidates could not. Aldric rose from the bed slowly, and the room seemed to shrink around him. He was taller than any man Elowen had ever stood near, broad-shouldered and pale beneath the storm-colored light, with dark hair brushing his jaw and silver eyes that made every servant rumor feel suddenly too small. He did not look like a monster. That frightened her more. Monsters were easy to fear. Men who looked exhausted, controlled, and lonely were harder to understand. "Name," he said. 1 word, low and rough, as if his voice had not been used in hours. "Elowen Vale, Your Majesty." "Vale," Cashin repeated, watching her too closely. "From the East Dormitory?" Elowen nodded. "Laundry, floors, and linen service." Aldric's eyes narrowed, not with anger, but recognition of something he could not explain. "You slept." Heat rushed to her face. "I am sorry. That was not an accusation." He stepped closer, and Elowen forced herself not to move. Every story she had heard told her to kneel, to submit, to keep her gaze low. Yet the pressure in the room did not crush her. It moved around her like a storm refusing to touch a candle flame. Aldric stopped 3 feet away. "Do you know what happens when others enter this room? They say your aura is too strong. They say many things." His jaw tightened. Most of them are kinder than the truth. For a moment, the king looked past her toward the tall windows where rain slipped down the glass like silver thread. "I have watched women chosen by my own council collapse beneath a power I never asked for. I have heard them scream at the sight of me after I did nothing but stand still. So tell me, little maid, why did you sleep as if my wolf was your hearth?" Elowen should have lied. A smarter girl would have begged forgiveness and blamed exhaustion. Instead, the truth slipped out softly. "Because I was not afraid while I was sleeping." Cashin went still. Aldric's gaze snapped back to hers. "What did you say?" Elowen swallowed. "I am always afraid in this citadel. Afraid of being dismissed. Afraid of owing more than I can repay. Afraid someone will remember I am useful only when I am silent. But last night, I did not dream. I did not feel cold. I heard your heartbeat, and for once, nothing chased me." The fire cracked. Aldric looked as if she had struck him. not with pain, but with something gentler and far more dangerous. "I did not dream either," he said. Cashin drew a careful breath. "Your Majesty, the council must be informed." "No," the answer came instantly. "If they know what she is to my wolf, they will turn her into a weapon, a cure, or a threat before sunset." Elowen stared at him. "What am I to your wolf?" Aldric did not answer. He reached for the black cloak at the foot of the bed and placed it around her shoulders before the cold could make her shiver. The gesture was simple, but Cashin looked away as if he had witnessed something more intimate than a kiss. "Until I understand this," Aldric said, his voice quiet enough for only her to hear, "no one touches you, questions you, or takes you from this wing without my command." Elowen should have felt trapped. Instead, beneath the weight of his cloak, she felt protected for the first time since she arrived in Ravenholt. Then she stepped backward toward the door, needing air, needing distance from the silver pull in his eyes. The moment her hand crossed the threshold, every silver lamp in the west wing went dark at once, and somewhere deep inside the walls, the king's wolf gave a low, broken sound like the citadel itself was begging her not to leave. The west wing did not forgive Elowen for leaving. The moment the silver lamps died, every guard in the corridor stepped back as if the darkness itself had teeth. Elowen froze with one hand on the doorframe, Aldric's black cloak still wrapped around her shoulders, warm with the scent of cedar smoke and winter rain. Behind her, King Aldric Wraithborne stood perfectly still, but the air around him changed. It did not crush her. It reached for her. Cashin whispered for the servants to clear the hall, and within seconds, the corridor emptied, leaving Elowen alone beneath. The dead lamps with the most feared king in Ravenholt watching her as if she were the only light left in the citadel. By sunset, the order was written in black ink and sealed with the royal mark. Elowen Vale, debt maid of the Lower East Dormitory, was reassigned as the Alpha King's night attendant. The housekeeper nearly dropped the paper. The other servants stared as if Elowen had stolen a crown and hidden it under her plain gray dress. Lady Seraphine Greymark, who had arrived for court that afternoon in white velvet and pearls, smiled at the news with a softness that did not reach her eyes. "How charming," she said, loud enough for every maid to hear. "His Majesty has taken a liking to small helpless things." Elowen kept her face still, but the words found old bruises inside her heart. That night, she returned to the West Wing with a tray of tea, a stack of old ledgers, and the deep fear that one wrong breath could ruin her life. Aldric was seated near the window, dressed in black, his crown absent, his sleeves rolled to his forearms. Without the throne room, without the guards, without the silver command in his eyes, he looked less like a legend and more like a man who had forgotten what rest felt like. "You do not have to stand by the wall," he said. Elowen blinked. "They won't stand." "Not here." He nodded toward the chair near the fire. "See." She obeyed because arguing with a king seemed foolish, but she sat on the very edge, hands folded tightly. For the first hour, neither spoke. She read inventory numbers in a soft voice while he closed his eyes. At first, his breathing remained guarded, uneven, like a wolf pretending not to be hunted. Then slowly, impossibly, it settled. The fire warmed the room. Rain tapped the glass. Elowen's voice grew steadier as she moved from grain counts to candle stores to linen repairs. Near midnight, her words faded. Exhaustion pulled at her shoulders, and her head dipped. When she woke a few minutes later, Aldric's cloak had been placed over her lap, and a fresh cup of tea sat beside her. He was across the room, pretending not to look. "You skipped supper," she said before she could stop herself. His eyebrow lifted. "Is my maid giving me orders?" "No, Your Majesty. I am reminding my king that even cursed men need bread." Silence followed. Then, for the first time, Aldric almost smiled. It was small, brief, and devastating. The next nights became a fragile rhythm. Elowen read. Aldric slept. She mended a torn cuff on his riding coat. He moved the sharp silver incense away, after noticing it made her cough. When a noblewoman mocked Elowen's repaired shoes, Aldric did not raise his voice. He only looked at her, and the woman fell silent so quickly the whole room understood. Protection from him was not loud. It was absolute. On the fourth night, thunder shook the citadel, and Aldric woke with a harsh breath, one hand pressed to the dark mark twisting across his wrist. Elowen moved before fear could stop her. She crossed the room and laid her fingers lightly over the mark. The air went still. His silver eyes locked on hers, and deep inside her mind, a voice not human, not fully wolf, whispered with aching certainty, "Little Luna." The whisper inside Elowen's mind vanished as quickly as it came, but it left the room trembling with a silence too deep to belong to ordinary stone. Her fingers still rested over the dark mark on Aldric's wrist, and beneath her touch, the twisted shadow in his skin softened to silver, like moonlight spilling through ink. Aldric stared at her hand as if it were a blade, a prayer, and a miracle all at once. "Did you hear that?" Elowen asked, her voice barely louder than the rain. Aldric did not answer immediately. His jaw tightened, and for the first time since she had met him, the Alpha King looked afraid. Not of her. For her. "My wolf has not spoken clearly to anyone in 7 years," he said. "Not to healers. Not to council elders. Not to the women they claimed were meant for me." Elowen pulled her hand back, suddenly aware of how close she stood. "Then why me?" Before Aldric could answer, the chamber door opened, and the royal healer stepped in with Cashin behind him. The old man's eyes went straight to Aldric's wrist, then to Elowen's pale face. "I need to test something," he said carefully. Aldric's voice dropped. "No, Your Majesty," the healer said, bowing his head. "If the girl can calm the Wraithborne curse, then she is not a coincidence." Elowen felt the word curse settle over her shoulders colder than any winter cloak. She had heard servants whisper it in kitchens and stairwells, but hearing it spoken in front of Aldric made it real. Cashin closed the door and lowered his voice. "If the council finds out before we do, they will either worship her or destroy her reputation by dawn." The test was simple. No knives, no pain, no old rituals with smoke and chanting. The healer placed a silver basin of moon water on the table and asked Elowen to dip 2 fingers into it. At first, nothing happened. Then the water brightened. A pale crescent formed on the surface, followed by the outline of a thorned crown and a valley flower Elowen had seen only once before, embroidered inside the baby blanket her mother had left behind. The healer stepped back so quickly his chair scraped the floor. "Valehaven," he breathed. Aldric went still. Cashin looked as if the walls had shifted around him. Elowen frowned. "That is not possible. My family name is Vale." "Because someone cut it in half," the healer said. House Valehaven was a Luna bloodline from the old Moon Kingdoms. They carried Mooncalm, a rare bond that could steady an Alpha aura without weakening the Alpha himself. The line was declared lost 80 years ago. Elowen could not move. All her life, she had been told she was debt, burden, and servant stock. Now strangers were looking at her like history had crawled out of the ashes wearing a maid's dress. Aldric crossed the room and stood between her and the door, not touching her, but shielding her from a world that was already becoming dangerous. "This leaves this room," he said, "and I will know." For 3 days, the secret held. Elowen continued serving at night, but everything had changed. Aldric watched her with a gentleness that made her chest ache, yet he kept a careful distance that hurt more than anger. He asked the healer for old records. He sent Cashin to seal the archives. He ordered guards to keep Lady Seraphine away from the West Wing. Elowen understood he was protecting her, but a cruel thought began growing in the dark spaces of her heart. Maybe he was ashamed. Maybe a king could need a maid in secret, but never choose her in daylight. On the 4th evening, while carrying folded linens past the council gallery, Elowen heard voices behind the half-open door. Lady Seraphine's tone was soft, polished, and poisonous. "If the maid is the true Luna," she said, "then bury the bloodline again before the king remembers how to love her." Elowen stood outside the council gallery with folded linens pressed to her chest, every breath trapped behind her ribs. Lady Seraphine's words slipped through the half-open door like poison wrapped in silk. "Bury the bloodline again." For one frozen second, Elowen wanted to run to Aldric, to tell him everything, to believe his shadow would be enough to protect her from people who smiled while sharpening lies. But before she could move, Lord Osric Vane answered from inside the room, his voice low, old, and certain. The king is not thinking clearly. The maid has made him dependent. Dependency can be mistaken for destiny. Elowen backed away before the linens could fall from her arms. That night, she did not go straight to the West Wing. She stopped in the servants' pantry, where a tray of tea waited under a silver cover with Aldric's crest stamped into the handle. The cup smelled faintly sweet, too sweet for the bitter black tea he preferred, and a cold warning moved through her before she understood why. She reached for it, but the pantry door opened behind her. Seraphine entered with 2 council guards and a look of perfect surprise. "How unfortunate," she said softly. The little maid caught alone with the king's tea. By sunrise, the entire citadel had heard the accusation. Elowen Vale, debt maid, night attendant, possible imposter, had been accused of using a calming potion to weaken the Alpha King and make him depend on her presence. No one asked why she would poison the only man who had ever protected her. No one asked why Seraphine had been waiting at the pantry door. In Blackthorn Citadel, truth moved slowly, but scandal flew on royal wings. Aldric came to the Moon Hall with Cashin at his side, his face pale with controlled fury, but the council had prepared for him. Lord Osric stood beneath the silver banners with an ancient decree in his hands, a law older than the current throne. Until the charge was cleared, Elowen had to be separated from the king to prove his will remained his own. The room watched him like wolves surrounding a wounded crown. Elowen watched only Aldric. His silver eyes found hers across the hall, and for the first time, the bond between them felt like a thread pulled tight enough to hurt. "She will not be touched," Aldric said. His voice was quiet, but every torch trembled. "No one has harmed her, Your Majesty," Osric replied. "We ask only distance. If she is innocent, your strength will remain unchanged." It was a trap dressed as logic. If Aldric refused, they would call him enchanted. If he agreed, Elowen would be taken from the one place his aura could breathe. Cashin leaned close and whispered something urgent, but Aldric did not look away from Elowen. She saw the war in him. King against wolf. Duty against instinct. Fear for her against need for her. Slowly, with visible pain, he gave one nod. The guards moved toward Elowen, not roughly, but with the cold confidence of men obeying a room that had already judged her. She lifted her chin before anyone could see it shake. When she passed Aldric, she stopped just long enough for her voice to reach him. "I gave you peace because I wanted to," she said. "Not because I wanted your crown." Something broke in his expression then, something no court witness should have been allowed to see. Elowen was taken to the North Servants' Tower, a narrow place of locked doors, gray windows, and wind that never warmed. By nightfall, Blackthorn Citadel changed. The halls went silent. The palace, wolves refused food. The silver lamps in the west wing burned blue and cold. Aldric did not rage. He did not threaten. He simply stopped sleeping, stopped speaking, stopped pretending the distance was survivable. Alone in the tower, Elowen pressed a hand to her chest as a strange ache bloomed beneath her skin, exactly where her cheek had once rested against his heartbeat. Far below, behind stone and crown and council law, Aldric heard his wolf clearly for the first time since childhood. "She is leaving," it growled inside him, shattered and certain. "We will not survive the silence." By the third night without Elowen, Blackthorn Citadel no longer felt like a palace. It felt like a heart that had forgotten how to beat. The great fires burned low no matter how much wood the servants added. The royal wolves paced the courtyards beneath a moon hidden by clouds. Even the guards spoke in whispers, because silence had become the king's new command. Aldric Wraithborne sat alone in the west wing, untouched tea cooling beside him, his crown resting on the table like something that belonged to another man. He had not slept. He had barely spoken. Yet the most frightening thing was not anger. It was stillness. The entire Dominion could feel its Alpha King pulling away from the world, inch by inch, as if the space Elowen had left behind was becoming a grave for everything human in him. Cashin Thorne entered just before dawn with rain on his cloak and a sealed packet in his hand. "I found the apothecary ledger," he said. Aldric did not turn. "Speak." Cashin placed the papers on the table. The potion was ordered under Lady Seraphine's private mark 3 days before Elowen was accused. The pantry servant was paid to leave the tray unattended. Lord Osric signed the witness transfer himself. The silver in Aldric's eyes sharpened, but his voice remained low. "Where is Elowen?" Cashin's jaw tightened. "They are moving her to the Moon Hall for judgment. Osric wants the court to declare her a false Luna before the archives can be opened." The room changed. Not with a roar, not with violence, with decision. Aldric stood, and every lamp in the west wing flared white. "Then the court will hear the truth from its king." In the Moon Hall, Elowen stood alone beneath the silver banners of Ravenholt, wearing the same gray dress she had worn the night she first carried blankets into the Forbidden Wing. Around her, nobles filled the stone benches, their faces polished with pity, curiosity, and quiet cruelty. Lady Seraphine stood beside Lord Osric in white silk, looking almost sad, as if ruining an innocent. Girl was a burden she had gracefully accepted. "Elowen Vale," Osric announced, "you are charged with deception, unlawful influence over the Alpha King, and claiming a bloodline that cannot be proven." Elowen lifted her chin. She was afraid, but she would not give them the shape of her fear. "I claimed nothing. You feared what I might be." A ripple moved through the court. Seraphine smiled. Poor child. Even now, she speaks like someone taught her she mattered. The great doors opened before Elowen could answer. Wind swept through the hall, carrying rain, cold air, and the scent of cedar smoke. Every wolf in the room lowered their head before they understood why. Aldric entered without guards, without ceremony, and without the crown on his brow. He held it in one hand, the black iron circlet that had ruled Ravenholt for 300 years. His eyes found Elowen first. Not the council, not Seraphine, not the throne, her. For one breath, the whole world narrowed to the distance between them. Then Aldric walked to the center of the hall and set the crown on the floor at Elowen's feet. The sound echoed like thunder trapped in stone. "If my throne requires me to betray the woman who brought peace to my wolf," he said, his voice calm enough to terrify every noble present, "then Ravenholt may keep the throne." Lord Osric went pale. "Your Majesty, you cannot mean that." Aldric turned, and the court felt the full weight of an alpha who had finally chosen truth over fear. "I mean every word." Cashin stepped forward and raised the sealed ledger. The potion was planted. The witness was paid. The accusation was arranged by Lady Seraphine Greymark under Lord Osric's protection. Gasps broke across the hall. Seraphine's perfect face cracked. Elowen could barely breathe. Aldric came closer, stopping only a foot away, close enough for her to feel the quiet pull that had haunted them both. "I should have trusted you before they took you from me," he said softly. "I am sorry." Beneath Elowen's dress, warmth bloomed over her chest, right where her cheek had once rested against his heartbeat. Silver light spilled through the fabric, forming a crescent mark bright enough for the whole court to see. Aldric looked down, and his wolf spoke through his eyes before his mouth shaped the words. "My Luna has answered." The silver crescent beneath Elowen's dress did not fade. It brightened until the Moon Hall looked less like a courtroom and more like a chapel carved from winter light. Every noble who had whispered against her went silent. Every guard who had once looked through her lowered his eyes. Even Lady Seraphine took one step back, her white silk suddenly seeming less like purity and more like costume. Elowen stood frozen at the center of it all, Aldric's crown at her feet, his apology still warm between them, and for the first time in her life, no one could pretend she was invisible. Lord Osric recovered first, because men who lived on lies always reached for another one. "A mark can be forged," he said sharply. "Relics can imitate old blood. This proves nothing." Cashin opened the apothecary ledger, but Aldric lifted one hand. "Then let the archives speak." At his command, the royal healer stepped forward, carrying a black velvet case sealed with wax that bore the crest of Ravenholt's first king. Inside lay a strip of moon-woven parchment, thin as breath, preserved for generations beneath the citadel. The healer held it near Elowen, and the ancient ink woke like stars. Words appeared across the page in silver. House Valehaven, keeper of moon calm, bloodline bound to Wraithborne in the hour of shadow. The court stirred like a field before a storm. Elowen could barely hear them over the pulse in her ears. Valehaven, not debt, not burden, not a servant name cut short to hide shame. A house, a history, a truth buried so deeply that even her mother had only left hints in old blankets and half-remembered lullabies. Lady Seraphine's smile vanished. "Convenient," she whispered. The healer turned toward her. "What is convenient, my lady, is the false Luna relic found in your chamber this morning." Cashin held up a pearl comb set with a pale stone. The same soft glow Seraphine had used for months to impress the council flickered across it, then died when exposed to Elowen's real mark. No one gasped this time. The silence was worse. It condemned her without needing to shout. Seraphine looked to Osric, but the old council lord would not meet her eyes. Aldric finally turned to them, and the room seemed to remember why kings were once feared and followed in equal measure. "You made my curse a chain," he said to Osric. "You turned my fear into politics. You used innocent women as proof that I was broken, then tried to destroy the one woman my wolf did not frighten." His voice never rose, yet every word landed like stone. Osric's face hollowed. Seraphine's hands shook at her sides. Elowen expected satisfaction to fill her, but what came instead was something quieter. Grief for the girl she had been. Grief for every night she had believed she was small because others needed her small. Then Aldric stepped back, giving her space instead of claiming it for her. "Elowen," he said, softer now, "you decide what happens next." The entire court looked at her. The former maid in the repaired gray dress. The girl who had once carried linens through back halls. The last daughter of a lost Luna house. Elowen walked to Aldric slowly. He did not reach for her. He waited. That waiting gave her more power than any crown. She lifted her hand and placed it over his chest, exactly where she had slept on that first impossible night. The court braced for the crushing wave of alpha aura they had feared for years. It never came. Aldric's shoulders lowered. His breathing softened. The silver fire in the high braziers steadied, and the wolves gathered outside the moon hall began to howl, not in warning, but in recognition. For the first time, Ravenholt did not see a cursed king and a dangerous maid. They saw an alpha and the Luna who could stand beside him without fear. One by one, the guards knelt. Then the nobles. Then the council members who had mocked her name. Cashin brought forward the Luna cloak, black velvet lined with silver, but when he placed it around Elowen's shoulders, the embroidered crest changed beneath everyone's eyes. The Wraithborne wolf faded into a moonlit valley crowned with thorns, the lost symbol of Valehaven. Elowen touched the living thread, and a vision flashed through her mind, a frozen kingdom beyond. The northern sea, an ancient throne under a white moon, and a voice whispering from the dark, "The bloodline has awakened." The vision struck Elowen so suddenly that her hand tightened around the living thread of the Luna cloak. For one breath, the moon hall vanished. She saw snow falling over a black sea, a white wolf standing on a cliff, and an ancient throne carved with the same crescent mark glowing over her heart. Then Aldric's hand covered hers, warm and steady, and the hall returned around her in a rush of firelight, bowed heads, and trembling silence. "Elowen," he murmured, his voice meant only for her. "Stay with me." The words were not a command. They were a plea from a king who had spent too many years being feared to know how to ask for comfort. Elowen looked up at him and saw the truth no rumor had ever carried. Aldric Wraithborne was not a monster waiting to be cured. He was a man who had been forced to survive as a weapon, a king taught that love was dangerous because his power could break what he wanted to protect. She turned her palm beneath his and laced their fingers together. The court saw it. The pack felt it. The bond between them did not explode like fire. It settled like moonlight over a battlefield after the last horn had gone quiet. Lord Osric and Lady Seraphine were removed from the Moon Hall under Cassion's command, not dragged, not harmed, only stripped of the authority they had used to poison the truth. Their names would be judged by the laws they had twisted. Elowen did not watch them leave. Her victory was not their humiliation. Her victory was standing in the center of Ravenholt with her name restored, her voice steady, and Aldric beside her by choice. That night, beneath the open roof of the Eastern Tower, the royal healer prepared the old bonding rite.
No grand spectacle.
No forced crown, only moon water, silver candles, the pack gathered below, and the Alpha King standing before the woman the Citadel had once called a ghost. Aldric removed the black iron crown from the table and held it between them. I was raised to be Ravenholt's shield, he said. Then its sword. Then its warning. For years, I believed peace was something I could give others but never touch myself. His silver eyes softened. You were the first person who looked at my darkness and did not call it all I was. Elowen's throat tightened, but her voice did not break. You were the first person who protected me without asking me to become smaller. The moonlight brightened. Their wolves stirred beneath their skin, not fighting, not claiming by force, but recognizing what had been waiting since the first night. She fell asleep to the sound of his heart. Aldric touched his forehead to hers, careful even then, giving her every chance to step away. Elowen stepped closer instead. The mate bond completed in silence, in breath, in the soft glow of two crescent marks answering each other. Across Blackthorn Citadel, every silver lamp lit at once. The royal wolves lifted their heads and howled, not from fear, but from relief. At dawn, Ravenholt woke to something no servant, guard, or noble had heard in 7 years. Nothing. No restless pacing from the West Wing.
No scattered silence.
No storm of alpha aura pressing against the walls. Only morning bells, birds over the black towers, and the quiet miracle of a king asleep. Elowen lay with her cheek against Aldric's chest, just as she had on the first night, but this time she was not lost, punished, or afraid. His arm rested around her with the gentleness of a vow, and his heartbeat was steady beneath her ear. "My Luna," he whispered without opening his eyes. She smiled against him. "My king." Far beyond Ravenholt, across the northern sea, a white wolf stepped through the falling snow and bowed before an ancient throne. Around its neck hung a silver crest shaped like a moonlit valley crowned with thorns. When it opened its eyes, they shone with the same pale light as Elowen's mark. And in the ruins of the Forgotten Kingdom, an old voice whispered, "The moon soothe Luna has awakened. Now the old kings will come home."